Hi there, and welcome to this lecture on Student Engagement and Learning Needs, Topic 3. This session is going to look at some of the problems we encounter as teachers in trying to inspire and maintain students' engagement with our discipline. We'll look at issues of teaching and learning style, and also of session planning, asking how we can identify and respond to student needs as teachers. So by the end of the session, I'm hoping that you'll be able to firstly, identify likely student needs in a given learning situation. Secondly, to analyse how teachers can respond to those needs in order to maintain student engagement. And thirdly, to evaluate the utility of different learning styles and teaching theories in responding to these identified student needs. So what do we mean by learning needs? It's quite simple really. We mean what students need in order to learn. Now there are quite a lot of things that can influence student learning needs, including us, and they're not always under our control. So sometimes students will have learning needs that we just can't fulfill as teachers. Nevertheless, there are some things that we can predict will influence what students need to learn. Things like cultural background will often affect the way that students engage with the subject. Disability will give a lot of students specific additional learning needs. Student skill level will also give them needs. Some students might be very skilled in one area of your subject already, but they might need bringing up to scratch in another area. I know that mathematics skills are a particular problem for a lot of scientific subjects, for instance. Previous experience will be a really big influence, especially at university, where not all students are coming straight from school. So quite a lot of students will have experience of work and experience of life in general that they'll bring to your course. What is being taught? So different subjects will obviously engender different needs in students, but also different areas in different subjects. Some areas may be very theoretical, and so students might have the need to have a lot of theories explained, and some areas might be practical, so there might be a need for a lot of demonstration in that area. When and where this lesson takes place is a really big factor in student needs. If you've ever taught a 9 AM on Monday session, perhaps when the weather's rainy and cold, in a stuffy room, you'll know what I mean. Students are affected by their environment because they're human, and so are we. So if we can look to the environment, look to the time of the session, we can actually identify quite a few student needs. And finally, the intellectual and professional context. So if students are embarking on a medical degree, which has a very specific professional context, they're all thinking of becoming doctors, they'll have different student needs to, say, students embarking on an English degree, which leads to a lot of different careers, so they don't have kind of a set professional context. And those are just a few of the influences that can possibly affect students' learning needs. So now we're going to look at a couple of different learning styles. Learning styles refer to the idea that different people learn better when they receive information in particular ways. So there are quite a few theories around learning styles, where theorists have claimed to identify particular styles of learning, essentially, which are kind of ways in which they think students learn. And for a good review on kind of whether this mode of theorizing is actually worthwhile, see Kozhevnikov et al. 2014, which is a really useful review and has quite a lot of good literature in it. And that's available in a PDF format on your QM Plus module page, and you'll be able to see it after this lecture. One of the most common learning styles is known as VARK, which stands for Visual, Auditory, Read, Write, or Kinetic. And that was invented by Neil Fleming. Not in 2014, but that's the latest update. Fleming claims that there are certain people who are visual learners or auditory learners or kinesthetic learners or reading and writing learners, and that these people learn better when information is presented in their preferred way. So a visual learner will learn better from looking at the diagram on this slide, but an auditory learner will be learning from my voice because they'll be learning from what they hear. A read and write learner will be reading the slide more than listening to my words, and a kinesthetic learner might be taking notes or doing some other tactile activity to keep themselves interested. Another common learning style is known as experiential learning. This was developed by David Kolb, an educational psychologist. And according to Kolb, the model on the right-hand side shows that there are different stages of learning from experience. It's not just a matter of having the experience and then learning from it. The best learning and teaching will incorporate all 4 of the stages, which are shown in blue. So the best learning will have you doing things, thinking about how you feel things, watching things, and thinking about things. But Kolb thought that people tended to fall into one of the 4 quadrants shown in yellow. So you might be an activist and you prefer to kind of think about things than do things. You might be a pragmatist, so you prefer to theorize and do things. You might be a reflector, so you prefer to kind of feel things and watch things. Or you might be a theorist, so you tend to think and watch, but not necessarily to do. Some subjects tend to make much more use of one stage in particular than others, because some subjects are more theoretical than others, and I think that particularly applies to sort of subsets of a discipline. So, for instance, theoretical physics might have less of the doing than experimental physics. However, in most subjects you get the doing as well as the feeling, the watching and the thinking. So there's always scope for including all 4 aspects of the cycle in your teaching. So the existence of learning styles is obviously very useful for thinking about the different ways in which people might learn, but that still leaves the question of, can it help us to meet learning needs? And fundamentally, it's just impossible to identify what students' learning styles are. It might be possible if you have 4 or 5 students in a classroom to identify, oh, this person is a really visual learner, this person is a really auditory learner, because they always listen to everything but they don't necessarily look at the diagrams. But if you've got classes of 200 or even say 15 or 20, it would just be a massive waste of time to try and identify each student's preferred learning style and then try to teach to it. But there is a possibility that we can use learning styles theory to inform how we teach in a different way. Because these learning style theorists have looked at the different ways in which information can be presented, we can use that to make sure that we present our information in different ways, perhaps presenting information in different ways at the same time. So I've got these slides with diagrams, with text that you can read, so hopefully attracting both read and write and visual learners, but I'm also reading out the words. I've got an audio aspect. So in that way it's aimed to kind of encourage people who are visual learners and people who are auditory learners. But you can also use it to allow students to experience things in different ways. So for the experiential learning, you can give students time for planning, time for acting, time for observing, and time for reflection. So it means you just leave space for them to do all 4 activities. And that doesn't require you to make sure that students prefer thinking or they prefer reflecting. It just means that you leave space so that people can take more time on the activities that they're better at and that they need. So learning styles can help us meet learning needs, but there are also some more practical tools that you can use. Presentation and teaching style is a huge one here. So think about the content that you're going to be teaching and the different ways that you might present it. This is the other place that learning styles can be useful. Some material actually just works better in being presented in a visual style or an auditory style, and so that's not the style of the learner necessarily, but it just refers to a style of presenting information. And that's something that really comes out in the 2014 review, if you choose to read it. So if you're teaching statistics, you might want to use a lot of diagrams to show how statistics can be visualized on the page. But you might want to use a more kinesthetic style if you're teaching a practical skill, because you want students to be able to practice actually doing something, not just kind of watching you do something. You can also use lesson planning as a tool to try and meet learning needs. If you've identified students' learning needs from the influences I talked about in the first slide, you can plan your lesson in response to them. So if you're teaching late in the day and you know that students are going to be tired, students might need a break where they wouldn't normally, and you can plan for that. If you know you've got a student with dyslexia, for example, you could give them extra time for reading or the chance to listen to a passage rather than just reading it off the screen. there are also issues like if you have a lot of students who are culturally not very experienced with group work, you can plan your lessons so that they are introduced to group work gradually. So lesson planning is a really important space where you can sit and think about the needs of your students and what needs your material might be kind of bringing to those students as well, and kind of build that into the plan. Evaluation is also a tool for meeting learning needs on the other side of the lesson. So sometimes we can sort of sense that students have a need that we're not meeting. We can sense that they're not responding to what we're doing, but it's really hard to tell why or what we could do about it. So collecting mid-course evaluation, perhaps through post-it notes, where you just give the students a post-it note, tell them to write down something they like or something they don't like about the course, and then collect them in anonymously, or using an online poll, or just even asking students if they're not afraid to talk in front of you. This can give really vital information on what the students' needs are that you can then use in planning the next session. So it's not a case of, oh, I've done these 3 things, it's, I've evaluated, and now I can go back to my lesson planning and I can go back to my teaching style with this new information I have about the student needs.